Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tuve. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee and the Archives and Special Collections Department of the University Libraries, welcome to First Fridays. This season, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of First Fridays, featuring anniversaries, beginnings, milestones, and memories throughout our collections. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson, in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube channel within the next few weeks. A special thank you to Alan and Jason from Middle English Interpreting, who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's presentation. If you have any questions for our speakers, please submit them at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A rather than the chat so that we can keep track of your questions. We will share the questions with our speakers at the end of the program for them to address as time allows. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. We have two presentations for you today. The first, titled Minnesota Landscapes, Documenting Environmental History Through Archival Sources, will be presented by Katelyn Morken, project archivist from the University of Minnesota Archives. This past year, University Archives processed archival collections that document Minnesota's natural resources, watersheds, flora and fauna, agricultural and land use, urban environments, conservation efforts, and climate change. Learn more about Minnesota's environmental history and the people who created the records. The second presentation, titled How Did We Get Here? Moving the History of Computing to the University of Minnesota, will be presented by Amanda Wick, curator of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives. Collections come in all shapes and sizes, some as small as a folder or single item, some as large as an entire repository. The story of the Charles Babbage Institute's archives and how they and the Institute itself ended up at the University of Minnesota is the story of several activist members from one tiny organization dedicated to preserving the history of computing, seeking their match at a major academic research institution. Now, let's turn things over to Katelyn for the first presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. Share my screen here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katelyn Morken, and I am the project archivist in the University Archives, overlooking the grant project, Minnesota Landscapes, Documenting Environmental History Through Archival Sources. So, funded in part by the state of Minnesota from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, through the Minnesota Historical Society, like Rebecca mentioned, this project documents the environmental history found within archival collections in the university archives, but mainly what focuses on the Minnesota's natural resources, agricultural land, urban growth, conservation efforts, and climate change, just to name a few. And so today I will be reviewing this project, its accomplishments up to this point, and highlighting one of the collections completed, the Gordon Goulion papers. And so this 56-week project has been made up of 32 archival collections. And I, along with the assistance of student workers, temporary staff, as well as my colleagues within the University Archives Unit, have and are still completing processing of each of these collections, and will do so by the end of this spring. And these archival collections include professor papers, such as the John Adams papers, who is an emeritus professor within the geography department, and who has looked over regional and economic development and urban planning, both within the United States and within the former Soviet Union. We also include papers such as the John Neitzel papers, who was a researcher within the School of Forestry, now known as the Department of Forest Resources, from 1947 to 1951. And his study primarily looked at wood preservation and treatment, specifically for fence posting, both on the farm and at home. And this project has also included departmental records, such as the Department of Anthropology, which contains course materials and documents archaeological projects undertaken both within the land in Minnesota and neighboring states, as well as records from the Department of Earth Sciences, which contains aerial photographs of locations associated with geological projects, along with reports and other departmental materials. There are also a number of organizational records, such as the Limnological Research Center, which contains material related to research and studies of lake water, water quality, and nutrient levels for plants and animals within the lakes of Minnesota, as well as the Mineral Resource Research Center records, known previously as the Mines Experiment Station. These documents record the iron mining industry within Minnesota, and they also include testing plants associated with the center that helps students have hands-on experience with minerals found in northern Minnesota. This collection includes laboratory notebooks, reports, and blueprints of equipment implementation. So in processing and in publishing descriptive finding aids for these collections, many have had increased viewership and use since the beginning of this project. In one instance, weather station locations within the Gordon-Gullion papers were used by students as a part of a class project. His material was also used currently as a primary resource in exemplifying the creation of wildlife management coursework and projects that the University of Minnesota did in conjunction with state agencies. Others include a researcher who is studying documentation related to archaeological dig sites within the Department of Anthropology records. And another researcher helped to fund the digitization of slides and audio recordings of vegetational history documenting field trips taken to both Glacial Lakes State Park in 1993 and the Ordway Prairie in 1980 by Emeritus Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior, Dr. Cushing. And so both of these can be viewed and listened to on UMedia. We are ultimately excited to see that these, by processing and describing these collections successfully, that the accessibility and use of their material has positively improved. Beginning in April of 2021, when this grant project started, I began processing the Gordon-Gullion papers. And after its delivery from the Cloquet Forestry Center in January of that year, the material was found in Gullion's old office in the basement of the center and included roughly about 102 boxes, 2 map cases, and 5 oversized map boards, all of which contained about 50 years worth of work and study at Cloquet. Known as Mr. Ruffed Grouse, Gordon-Gullion began his career in the Nevada Fish and Game Department from 1951 until 1958. But in need of a variation in weather and in animal species, he moved up north and began as a research associate for the Department of Entomology, Fisheries, and Wildlife at the University of Minnesota, now known as the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. He held that position from June of 1958 until 1968 when he became a research associate. And then by 1975, had advanced to an associate professor. In his time at the University of Minnesota, Goulian focused primarily on small mammals and game birds, but specifically looked at the ruffed grouse. And Goulian inspected the management and habitat of the ruffed grouse for the next 32 years, ultimately revealing the effect of the aspen tree, both as a food source and as habitat that helped enhance the lifespan of this species. So included in his research was the genealogical work of those before him, whose study of the ruffed grouse influenced his own work. And this includes Ralph King, an instructor at University Farm who studied the population of ruffed grouse from 1928 to 1937 at the University of Minnesota. At the time, the ruffed grouse were in danger of becoming extinct due to their low population across the country. And King, with his research, was determined to answer why. It was determined at this time that King began developing a scientific basis for the conservation and management of the ruffed grouse. He implemented his own method in estimating the population of the grouse, what soon became known as the strip census method or the King method. This is where a researcher would walk within a predetermined forest area and record the number of ruffed grouse that would be flushed or forced out of the trees, while also recording the distance at which they were at from that flushing. And so this data was then used more broadly with additional forest areas, and the population density would be computed per unit area. So this data set was one of the only remaining research studies on the ruffed grouse at that time. And so when starting in 1958, Goulian utilizes his early work heavily in comparison to the information he was gathering on the ruffed grouse in Cloquet. And so in his method, Goulian used drumming logs, which observes mating calls done by the male ruffed grouse, who creates a drumming sound while standing on top of a log and simultaneously compressing air through flapping their wings continuously. And so a researcher will listen within an area for 4 to 5 minutes long and record the number of drums heard. The study is repeated at 10 different stops within an area, approximately about 1 mile apart year after year, to assure a reliable index of data. Though this data does not indicate an actual total number of ruffed grouse within an area, the data does help indicate the survival rate between winter and summer. And so in order to keep track and compare these data sets, Goulian recorded both his own and Ralph King's data on large coding paper using the imperative program language Fortran, and which can be found within his papers. So as Goulian relied heavily on banding the ruffed grouse outside of drumming logs for further analysis on if a bird survived a season and how, if it is the case, that they died, be it from a lack of food to eat or environmental concerns, or possibly if they were eaten by a predator. And these bands were color-coded and etched with a specific number and looped around the leg of a ruffed grouse like a cuff. Additional data was also recorded so that the ruffed grouse would be further identifiable in future years. So though banding was ideal in providing detail to individual birds, it also required work in tracking down each one for an annual survey. And because of this, the idea of using a radio transmitter to track mating rituals and flight patterns of the ruffed grouse during off seasons was spurred. This method was initiated by Dr. William Marshall, professor of ecology and wildlife management at the University of Minnesota, in the spring of 1960. It featured a small radio transmitter created and built by Minneapolis Honeywell Regulated Company, which was harnessed on the backs of the ruffed grouse. They were then released back into their habitat for further exploration. So with the help of Goulian and 3 other researchers, Robert Seablum, Robert Schwab, and John Kuba, Marshall was able to efficiently begin what was dubbed the Grossart Project. Marshall and the team would begin by trapping the male house while they were preparing to drum on a log. A box with a mirror inside was placed on the log so that when the male grouse landed near it, it would see its own reflection and think it was another bird. It would soon approach it and end up being trapped within that box. The radio transmitter was then attached at that point, and the release of the bird then followed. So once on the ruffed grouse, this radio transmitter continuously put off a radio emission through a beeping signal, which would then be picked up through a two-directional antenna, one located on a fire tower and the other on a TV tower at Cloquet. So 6 grouse participated in the GROSAR project, and each were surveyed by the radio transmitters for 24 hours. Through rotating the antennas, the signal was picked up by an operator, and a location was able to be identified. He then would contact his partner with the information, and then that operator would then use those readings to triangulate the location of where the grouse was within a few square feet. This data was projected to provide information on how grouse reacted to weather changes, such as if they retreated to evergreens with colder weather or went to hardwoods during warmer weather. They also hoped to see how far the grouse would move from feeding to roosting areas, if their mating habits were monogamous or polygamous, and if there were any forest wildlife management practices that could be improved in order to support their livelihood. So ultimately, there were high hopes of this project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation and conducted in cooperation with the Minnesota Conservation Department, that it would produce successful results. However, many of these questions remained unanswered as their findings were inconclusive during their study. And because of this, in 1963, a 20-gram transmitter, which was significantly lighter than the original 1.5-ounce transmitter, was attempted. And so this one was designed by Cloquet's electronics engineer, Sidney Markison, and it fit more like a backpack than a harness. Though this one, too, did not produce the results that they were expecting, and due to this, the National Science Foundation ended the project in 1966. This tracking of population data soon led Goulian to further analyze the effect of grouse habitat, both the ecological elements and forest management on the ruffed grouse. It was one day while reviewing his map board over lunch, which contained data and sightings of ruffed grouse while eating, that he noticed a pattern in the age of the aspen in which the ruffed grouse were eating from. These aspen were mature, about 10 to 20 years old in age, and filled with their dormant male flowers called catskins. And aspens produce more of these buds as they age, making it evident that ruffed grouse rely heavily on their production to survive the winter. He then noticed that young aspen saplings were ideal for coverage while nesting and during broad rearing season, as it helped protect the young grouse from predators. Therefore, as Goulian looked out over Cloquet, he knew that some form of forest management was needed for the perfect balance between young and mature aspens in order to keep ruffed grouse alive. So from this realization, Goulian understood that providing controlled burns to areas of dense vegetation was essential in making sure that ruffed grouse were obtaining enough food and shelter. And in that way, members at Cloquet would be able to initiate and foster a favorable environment so that the ruffed grouse will live longer. In that way, dense areas were thinned out and young saplings were put in place in order to create that successful balance. Other ecological data gathered at the Cloquet Forestry Center was weather data. Weather posts were marked at various areas within Cloquet, and data such as precipitation, snow accumulation, as well as temperature were gauged. This data was used in conjunction with the population data of the ruffed grouse to see what climatic attributes could be associated with the livelihood of the ruffed grouse. In order to survive the winter months, ruffed grouse also rely heavily on a large amount of snow with relatively mild temperatures. In general, they're in danger of other larger birds, such as goshawks and the great horned owl, mostly during the winter months, as the trees do not have as much coverage. Instead, ruffed grouse take to snow burrowing, where they nosedive from the top of an aspen tree into a snowbank. They go as far as 8 to 10 inches in order to both keep warm from the winter conditions, as well as preventing them from getting eaten by a predator. Because of this, ruffed grouse rely on the perfect weather condition in order to survive. If there is a minimal amount of snow, the grouse won't be able to burrow far enough for coverage. And if the weather conditions are too cold, the snow surface will be too hard and the grouse will be able to break through the icy top at all. This data, along with the ecological data from both of the individual weather stations and observations of aspen trees, are a large part of the material found in the Gordon-Goulion papers. Other additional data collected by Goulion for further analysis on the livelihood of the ruffed grouse include individual bird data, which measures specific characteristics of individual grouse. So each grouse that is banded by Goulion would be observed for additional information that would help identify them in future surveys. Data collected include their sex, their age, feather dimensions, and feather colors. This data was recorded on a punch card where the edges were punched according to a defined coding system based on the metadata found during the observation. Additional data is then recorded and written on the card, and including, as you can see, some of the details of what their feathers look like. Another data set includes the wing and tail study data, which illustrates the collecting of feathers from ruffed grouse trapped for banding or from predator kills or from the molting season. Some of these feathers were mounted on feather cards and contain notes on their measurements and coloring. Each bird will have a different wing and tail data, including color faces, so it was important to note these details for further individual bird studies. And lastly, hunter research data is also included within Goulion's research and contains surveys that were sent out to hunters during the hunting season, which allowed them to record any of their successes as well as their party size. These surveys were then evaluated on a seasonal basis to track further data on the population of ruffed grouse harvested in a given year. Data included where the bird was shot, how many shots were taken, time of the day the bird was shot, and an area to locate where within the forest area the grouse was killed. So outside of this overarching research, Mr. Ruffed Grouse continued to work within the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota up until 1990. He served as the chair of the research committee on the National Board for the Ruffed Grouse Society from 1972 to 1990. He also obtained the Minnesota Award in 1979, the Governor's Wildlife Management Award in January of 1991, and was honored by the Isaac Walton League with its Honor Roll Award. With his 32 years of intense research on the ruffed grouse, Goulion did write a few books: Grouse at the North Shore, written in 1984, and The Ruffed Grouse, written in 1989. And sadly, he was still writing his third book when he passed away from his long battle with lung cancer on September 23rd, 1991. In honor of him and his research, the University of Minnesota created the Gordon-Goulion Endowed Chair of Forest Wildlife Research and Education in 1998. This chair helps fund a research professor position who focuses on developing a program on the ecology and management of forest wildlife at the University of Minnesota. I am very grateful that I was able to process the Goulion papers and to preserve his nationally and internationally recognized research on the ruffed grouse and make it available to the public. To learn more on our exciting archival discoveries found in the additional 31 collections this grant project has uncovered, please visit our blog, Minnesota Landscapes, for more information. Thank you. And now I'll be turning it over to Amanda Wick of the Charles Babbage Institute Archives, who will be speaking on the history of computing at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Katelyn. Let me just share my screen. So I am Amanda Wick, and I'm the curator of the Charles Babbage Institute at the University of Minnesota. I'm going to be talking about how we got here, but also about a series of firsts and false starts that comprise the history of the Charles Babbage Institute, as well as how it's tied to Minnesota's place in computing history. So the history of CBI starts with a local tech pioneer named Erwin Tomasz. Upon graduating from the University of Minnesota, Tomasz joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps, where he worked with radar and was awarded the Bronze Star for his wartime activities. Following his time with the Army Signal Corps, Tomasz served at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, before joining the Engineering Research Associates. I'm going to be talking about the Engineering Research Associates, or ERA, quite a bit during this conversation, as they're kind of the foundation of the computing industry here in Minnesota. As a research associate at ERA, he worked on developing electronic computers, including the ERA 1103, or the Univac Scientific, as it came to be called. In 1956, he joined Telemeter Magnetic in Los Angeles, where he became the company's president. He then oversaw Telemeter Magnetic's design of core memories of 4 computers, and in 1962, left Telemeter and co-founded Data Products Corporation. In 1978, Erwin and his wife Adele Tomasz founded what we currently call Charles Babbage Institute as the International Charles Babbage Society, with an office in Palo Alto, California. Now, Erwin's interest in history didn't start and stop with the founding of the Charles Babbage Society. He was a collector of rare books and manuscripts on scientific history, and his collection at one point was valued in the millions. In 1979, the American Federation of Information Processing Societies became the principal sponsor of the society. The society was renamed as the Charles Babbage Institute, and companies and individuals in the information industries offered support. At this point, collecting was starting to become more of a feature and not a bug of the society, and AFIPS began to encourage a more permanent institutional home for the important sponsored scholarship and documentation work at the Charles Babbage Institute. Which brings us to our move to the University of Minnesota. In 1980, the University of Minnesota beat out more than 30 other institutions to sponsor and house the Charles Babbage Institute, with its focus on historical scholarship and documentation. A new supporting entity called the Charles Babbage Foundation was created to govern the institute as a partner with the university, a short-term partner as it eventually became defunct. Erwin Tomasz, at the same time, donated from his personal rare book and manuscript collection several rare first editions of Babbage's books, some signed by the author himself, as well as all of his publications from 1965 on. This collection became the cornerstone for our rare book collection that currently stands in the 10,000 volume range for both books and periodicals. In addition, Tomasz and several other former ERA and UMN alums banded together to endow a chair and directorship for the research faculty member appointed to be the director of the Charles Babbage Institute. The title today is held by Dr. Jeffrey Yost. In 1989, University of Minnesota assumed all authority for the Charles Babbage Institute after the closing of the CBF, and CBI became an organized research unit of the university with a recognition of its growing collection of historical resources that would be integrated into the Walter Library collection. Now, at this time, the director was still largely in charge of collecting and organizing collections. In 2001, CBI moved into the Anderson Library, and its collections became formally part of the Archives and Special Collections Department, with full custodial responsibility handed over to the university libraries. In 2018, as part of restructuring within the College of Science and Engineering, CBI became a research center within the graduate program in the history of science, technology, and medicine. Now, I've talked about CBI, but I should also talk about CBIA, which is the Charles Babbage Institute's archives. So we are two separate institutions, basically, under the same roof. But there is multiple points where we collaborate together. Some of the most prominent are in our work with sponsored fellowships, publishing, and actually archival collecting. So in regards to sponsored fellowships, we actually have two. The first of which is funded by a generous donation by Erwin and Adele Tomash again. And it's the annual Tomash Graduate Fellowship, which is awarded to and provides a $14,000 stipend to a standout graduate student for doctoral dissertation research in the history of computing, information, and culture. Past fellows, whose books you see on the screen right now, are among the leading scholars in the history of computing and information in society. The second sponsored fellowship is the Arthur L. Norberg Travel Fund, which was named for CBI's founding director and funded by generous gifts from his friends and colleagues. It provides short-term grants and aid to help graduate students, academics, and other researchers, with a preference given to graduate students, postdocs, and junior faculty, the funds to travel to CBI to use our archival collections. Since the start of the pandemic, however, with travel obviously being curtailed, we've transitioned these grants in particular to cover scans of collection materials. So I work closely with the fellows before, during, and after their arrival, and I sit on the evaluation panel actually for the Norberg Fellowship as well. I also co-edit with Dr. Yost a digital publication focused on the intersections of technology and culture called Interfaces. And in terms of collecting, I would say that the archives at CBIA are an outgrowth of the historical scholarship to start, and they include secondary literature as well as oral histories from grant-funded research. And these interviews actually serve a secondary function. So while the historians will use them, obviously, for research purposes, and they will share them with us to be put online and made accessible to the public, they also form the basis for relationships with individuals who end up ultimately donating significant archival collections. Now, historically in the past, there was a lot of overlap between the director and the archives. And indeed, the collections were not always part of the libraries. In the beginning, our original collecting policy focused heavily on technical history, not personal at all. In fact, early curators would actively strip out personal records that were not related to technical accomplishments or professional work. So a great example of that is the Frances Holberton papers. I'm going to probably talk about her quite a bit too. She's a foundational woman in computing history. So when you look at her collection, all that you will see is records pertaining to her employment with different computing companies and the work that she did while she was there. There is no documentation of her time at these companies and like any sort of personal experiences that she may have had, any stories related to her family or other interests. It is very tightly focused on technical accomplishments, which doesn't sound necessarily terrible, but as we know from doing history and doing historical research, there's that context that is critical to understanding the people behind these stories. Also, the original process for organizing and making things available was created more by a historian than an archivist. So what this means is that when material was donated to the archives, it was typically deconstructed to be organized by subjects to create reference files, or kind of like an artificial collection, I guess you could say, which is like the Russian, Soviet, and Eastern Bloc computing collection or our academic computing collection. There's a variety of those. So those are great from a researcher standpoint, right? You want to find some information about Russian computing in 1965, and I can send you directly to one specific collection where you can find out a good amount of material. However, these kinds of collections and these kinds of breaking apart of materials break the rules of archiving with respect to, basically our two main tenets, which is to maintain the original order of material, as well as the provenance of the collected material. We know that it's not just the records themselves that teach and provide important data or information for historians. It's that contextual information around it, the kind of holistic look at what a person may have been thinking, doing, feeling, and you can get that from a collection that is tied specifically to the creator. It's critical. So when did we change and how did this shift occur? So for one thing, we hired an actual trained archivist. We moved into this building where you cannot hide practices necessarily once you're integrated into the department. There's a ton of departmental support. And the result of this change is where we are at today, which is we are one of these 14 distinct archival collections at the U. including the University Archives with my colleague Katelyn Morken, Children's Literature Research Collection, the Sherlock Holmes Collection, Immigration History Research Center, and Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies. We all exist within this building in Elmer L. Anderson Library on the West Bank. Now, you know many of my colleagues, and as probably veteran First Fridays attendees, you've gotten to know their collections pretty well too. So that's kind of old news, I guess. But we are also something of a unicorn at the U, I should say. We're one of maybe only 2 research institutions with accompanying archives. The Immigration History Research Center is the other, or maybe you could say that we are one of 2 archives with accompanying research institutions. Now, there are maybe 5 institutions in the world that have collections that focus on the history of computing, but ours is certainly one of the largest and the most wide-ranging. CBI's collections focus on the history of computing and information technology, as well as range from the very, very technical to the completely human. As my predecessor, Arvid Nelson, who many of you may know, was very fond of saying, we are not just about boxes and wires, we are about the people who put them together and how culture is influenced by them. Some fast facts about where we stand today. There are about 300 distinct collections of records, including personal papers, corporate records, organizational records, subject files, as I mentioned, and then still in digital material. And we also have about 10,000 volumes of cataloged rare books and serials. And altogether, this comes to about a mile's worth of collection material. So we are not one of the largest necessarily, but we are certainly not the smallest. And the idea of a mile's worth of boxes and books put end to end, I think is kind of an interesting one. The oldest item in our collection is something from our namesake, Charles Babbage, and the youngest is something from last year. Like any archivist, I do have personal favorites from the collection, and I feel that they're really interesting because these are things that would have been thrown away in the past. And why I think they're critical is that they're full of these are like the personal elements of actual people who were wildly innovative, yes, willing to push the limits of possibility, absolutely, but above all, they're human, and that's what the story of history is. So CBI has a lot more within its holdings than the traditional archival records, although we obviously have quite a lot of that as well. But one of our least utilized, but possibly most significant collections is a grouping of gray literature, zines, broadsides, and pulps that investigate social issues and cultural dynamics within computing. Now, this was an area that was very close to the heart of my predecessor. And it's an area that I've really worked hard to make part of our collection, kind of continuing this tradition. It represents kind of the culmination of our efforts to move from just technical history to understanding cultural and social history related to the high-tech industry and computing. And all of these materials, I should say, are cataloged and searchable in the U of M's print catalog. Oral histories are also a huge component of CBI's archival holdings. The CBI historians utilize our archives for secondary research, of course, but they also cultivate these primary sources from within the computing industry through an extensive oral history program. And a few of the computer luminaries depicted here, Bill Norris, Bob Price, Betty Holberton again, they were interviewed by CBI historians and ultimately chose to donate their papers for us. So it's a huge point of collaboration and just like a very symbiotic relationship between the archives and the historians here. For a computer or history archive, we have a much smaller collection of electronic records than you might expect that are currently available. But that being said, within the next 5 years, I anticipate probably 90% of the collections that come in to be electronic, dominated by electronic records. So I think this is something that is going to be very quickly a thing of the past. I'd like to highlight one important fact about working in archives that I think I've kind of alluded to a little bit, but that this idea that collections are never one-dimensional and that early focus on technical history alone made it very difficult to see some of these hidden stories, hidden milestones, and these marginalized voices. And there are hundreds of stories within the CBI archives beyond the accepted historical narrative, some complementary, some not so much. Through the Umbra Search Project, which is a grant-funded project out of the Gibbons Collection of African American literature, to surface stories of African American history and culture, we were able to unearth and digitize a surprisingly substantial trove of 12 linear feet or so of publicity materials, collateral and correspondence between Edmund Berkeley and over 200 civil rights and social justice organizations. This is one of the most exciting aspects of archiving for me, is uncovering and finding these hidden stories within our archives. And it's an aspect of my job that I feel probably the most passionate about. So being involved with this was really exciting. And I'm so glad that we were able to participate. But we've talked about a lot of the firsts for CBI, why we came here, how we got here. And I've alluded to the fact that a major reason is due to Minnesota's prevalence in the field of computing and history, and Erwin Tomish's involvement with that early computing history. So let's talk just a bit now about another first for the state, which is Minnesota as the first Silicon Valley. So this is probably our strongest area of collection focus, which in the history of Minnesota's computing industry. One of the previous historians at CBI authored the book shown here, Digital State, and it's an extremely accessible documentation of the rise and fall of the industry here in Minnesota. Much of Tom's research was conducted through oral history interviews as well as archival research, most of which is searchable and available for use by the public at the CBI archives. And an abbreviated list of the collections are listed here. And I am very, very happy to talk at length about the history of computing in Minnesota, and I'm happy to do so at the Q&A. So I guess I got to start with a company that actually has no relation to Minnesota, but it will become clear, I promise, like very, very, very shortly. So the Eckert and Mauchly, not originally from Minnesota, but widely regarded as the inventor of one of the first electronic computers, the ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, which is shown here. But how it comes into Minnesota is that Eckert and Mauchly sold their company to Remington Rand in 1950, right as they were launching one of the first commercial business computers called the UNIVAC, which is how their story kind of starts to move to Minnesota. We don't have the Eckert and Mauchly papers at the CBI archives, but we do have personal accounts of some of their earliest employees. Now, the Engineering Research Associates, as I've alluded to before, was one of our first homegrown computer companies in Minnesota. They produced components, controls, memory drums, and systems primarily for the military starting in 1946. Companies and company founders and early employees like Erwin Tomash were all ex-military cryptographers and engineers, so they had an immediate connection with government contracting. However, the military connections of the founders eventually got ERA into some trouble after whispers of cronyism started to circulate in Washington, and Remington Rand, whenever they purchased Eckert and Mauchly, swooped in and bought ERA to complement the acquisition of Eckert and Mauchly in 1952. Under Remington Rand, the two computing divisions were originally kept separate, but were ultimately united under the UNIVAC name. UNIVAC survived the purchase of Remington Rand by Sperry Corporation, became known as Sperry Rand, and ultimately survives today as Unisys. Now, we have a great collection of records assembled by ex-Remington Rand, Sperry Rand, UNIVAC, and ERA employees at CBI that provide a wealth of insight into the twists and turns of the M&A activity and the approach to R&D in such a massive corporation. And it's so interesting because you can just see the evolution of not just what the company produced, but kind of how they thought about what they were producing. And it's a fascinating look if you're able to look at all of these different time periods. So I've really enjoyed that aspect. But I should also say that ERA was not the only local company purchased by Remington Rand or Sperry Rand. Fabritech was another. It's really not that well known, but they produced these very adorable little desktop electronic calculators that had extraordinarily advanced industrial design. We have a tiny collection of their material, and it's really got some cool stuff in it. I haven't seen too many people using it yet. The Controlled Data Corporation is probably the best known of the Minnesota supercomputing companies. Company founders left Sperry UNIVAC to start the company, and they included William Norris and Seymour Cray, both of whom are quite well known. Less well known, but also coming along for the ride, was the chief engineer at Sperry Rand, Frank Mullaney, We hold the Control Data Corporation records at CBI, as many people know, all 1,200 boxes of them. The records include photos, corporate records, film, personal papers, artifacts, executive histories, product documentation, and other ephemera. And this, along with the corporate records of the Burroughs Corporation, is without a doubt our most widely used collection. We are currently working to reprocess the materials. I mean, while it is still open, we are hoping to make it a more accessible and easily searchable collection for our researchers. And that's an in-progress project. Another well-known institution from Minnesota's supercomputing past is Honeywell. And its location outside the Twin Cities, they made lasers, computer controls for air and spacecraft and missiles. Again, we don't have these corporate records because Honeywell still exists, and surprisingly, companies that still exist don't like to donate their materials for open accessibility at research institutions. But we do have the records of a major lawsuit between Honeywell and Sperry Rand, as well as personal papers of former employees that include corporate records. Another interesting collection that we have is those of the Lockheed Martin Corporation, which also still exists. But when their office in Eagan closed, the company didn't request their records back, or they didn't request all of them back. So former employees kind of went dumpster diving to rescue these really priceless records. And the paper records were donated to us, while artifacts were donated to the Dakota County Historical Society. IBM Rochester is outside the Twin Cities, but a huge part of Minnesota's computing history. Our historians literally wrote the book on IBM Rochester. And in fact, I think they may have written actually about 3 of them. But the Rochester branch was very well known for its hyper-efficient manufacturing processes and assembly lines. And it was actually the top producer of microcomputers for the company. We don't have those corporate records because IBM, no surprise, likes to keep that kind of stuff locked up too. But we do have some oral histories with former employees, and actually a pretty good relationship with the archivist at IBM. So it is possible for us to learn more about the company through their archives. And then there's all these other guys, right? The U of M had the Gopher Protocol, which was one of the first methods for crawling the internet. We have that aerospace engineering group. We have General Mills, 3M, and all of these companies had significant presence in some way, shape, or form in the Minnesota computing industry before the world shifted to Silicon Valley. We have archives of the Gopher project, as well as oral histories from some of these other companies' employees, and also materials related to their collaborations between them and something like CDC usually in the Control Data Corporation records. But I think one of the pinnacle points of Minnesota's computing history has to be the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium and the Oregon Trail computer game. Now, this one is a fascinating one for me. And if you're interested in learning more about Oregon Trail, I strongly recommend TPT's documentary, which you can see on YouTube, about the origins of Oregon Trail. This was really a foundational computer point. This was my entree point in computing history. And I don't even want to guess at how many hours I logged on this game. But it's a fascinating story about a game that was created by a couple of alumni from Carleton College who were student teachers in the Minneapolis public schools. And the story of how it went to MECC and then later on to Apple is just a really interesting one. So strongly recommend checking out that documentary. Likewise, several years ago, TPT, with funding from a legacy grant, produced the documentary Solid State, Minnesota's High-Tech History. It is a very thorough, very accessible, very engaging documentary about the history of Minnesota's computing industry. A lot of the archival footage and materials came from CBI, and they interviewed a variety of folks who from past, present, and actually probably future major figures in Minnesota's computing. I see we've got a little bit of time left, so I just am going to play really quickly the opener for this to give you an idea of what we have.
Born of the man-guided calculations of the super-electronic brains, entire new industries are flashing into being.
We had Silicon Valley here. We had 4 big computer companies when Silicon Valley was still making transistors.
Minnesota roots are very deep in this business, without question. We are an innovative state. When you look back at the history, I think we're really bad at telling our story.
Nobody knows about it unless somebody asks.
It's a story that Minnesotans can be proud of.
For us to recognize those people who did that work.
You could raise your IQ just by breathing the same air as many of these people.
One of the top computer designers of all time.
I came to work early every day, mostly because I couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next.
Technology is one of those tools that can allow us to solve problems at scale.
That set of skills and people and networks is just as vital for Minnesota's high-tech future as it's been for its high-tech past.
So strongly recommend checking out TPT's documentary. It doesn't just have a bunch of talking heads. It does have some really wonderful archival footage I am so proud to have been a part of that documentary. It was incredibly exciting working on that and working with TPT. So with that, thank you so much for the time today and for your kind listening. And I'm happy to take any questions in Q&A.
Well, thank you, Amanda and Katelyn. We do have some questions that are populating here. Amanda, you talked a lot about local connections. What is the topic or collection that you are dying for someone to write a dissertation on?
From a local connection standpoint, I would love to see somebody investigate some of the industrial design of some of the computers in Minnesota. We talk a lot about the technology, and this is the fastest, this is the best, it has the largest memory. But what we don't talk about a lot is the industrial design, and some of the most advanced design in the high-tech industry probably came out of Minnesota. Cray supercomputers, well, yes, it's now kind of Wisconsin's story. Cray started with CDC, and so he was not just an incredible engineer, but he was truly a genius at industrial design. So I would love to see somebody talk about just the very unique industrial design capabilities of this state. I think it's a creative industry that people don't know that much about.
Great, thank you. I actually have a question for Katelyn. You mentioned that the Minnesota Landscapes Project is processing 31 collections?
32 collections.
32.
Yes.
Could you share with us a few of the examples or a few of the more collections that are part of this project?
Absolutely. And so kind of like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of professor papers. Currently, I have a student worker working on the Guy Gibbon papers. He was a member of the Department of Anthropology and did a lot of archaeological digs. We also had a botanist papers, as well as, just a breadth of knowledge in both environmental concerns and water quality. We had the papers of Linda K. Shane, the gray water, freshwater biological center. That's full name. We just have a breadth of records and papers on environmental concerns and Minnesota landscapes. And I just touched on one, but there are many that are included.
Great, thank you. And I have another question for Amanda. You talked a lot about the history of the Charles Babbage Institute archives. What is in store for the future?
I think what's in store for the future for CBI is a continued focus on social and cultural issues within technology. As part of an academic research institution, our focus on collecting is really driven a lot by our users. What is the user group interested in? What is the academic historian group interested in? And interestingly, for CBI, a vast majority, probably 95% of our researchers come from outside of the U of M community, from all over the world. And so it kind of gives you a really interesting insight into what's going on in the field. And I've been seeing a trend towards a lot more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research topics with folks coming in, not just from the history of science, technology, or medicine, but folks coming in from media studies, communication, anthropology, sociology. So that has been fascinating in seeing how these people find us and just the ways in which that they're working with technological history, and it's really fascinating. So I am hoping to continue collecting within those spaces. An area that we're looking at right now is human computer interaction and user design. So that's something that we're working on right now.
Thank you. We've had a few more questions pop up in that time. Amanda, if you could also talk a little bit more about telling marginalized stories. Was this in the context of the Institute or the collections at large?
I can only speak to the Charles Babbage Institute's archives, and I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this question correctly or not, so do feel free to correct me. But telling marginalized stories, this is an area within archives and the archival profession in the field that's really becoming more and more of an important focus. It's something that should always have been a focus, but much more so today. There's an awareness and an effort to not just curate history, but to not just curate and preserve history, but to document it and to find the areas within the historical record within which there are spaces. And to see what we can do about finding the stories that should be there and should be recognized, where possible, of course. And, one way of doing that is in future collecting and how we collect and how we think about collecting going forward. But another way to do that is to look back at the collections that we have. Issues like repatriative description, reviewing our finding aids, researching our collection, going deep into our collections to identify stories that don't make the finding aid even. This is an area of responsibility for us. And it's something that we take very seriously at the University of Minnesota in general. And it's something I take pretty seriously as the archivist for CBI.
Great. And one more question, Amanda. Someone wants to know if CBI has the papers from Cray Research.
No, we do not have papers from Cray Research. There is, I believe, a local historical society or museum that has most of those papers. So that would be something to check out in Chippewa Falls for sure.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question. So I'll ask Katelyn, what is one item instead of my question, I'll ask someone who has popped up here. Does the Minnesota DNR play a role in Minnesota landscapes?
Great question. Not specifically in any of Minnesota DNR in the collections, but in relation to some of the work that was done by Julian or others in the area working with state agencies, if there were questions, especially kind of within those hunting surveys or any type of field research and work, yes, there has been interactions with them and possibly communication or correspondence or information on different projects with that state agency.
Great. Thank you. We are nearing time here. So with that, I will say thanks again to our presenters, the interpreters, and to the library's technology staff who work behind the scenes to make this program possible. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a great weekend, everyone.